Welcome, everyone, to the very first AI-generated UWS CCT podcast. This is coming from the University of the West of Scotland Creative Computing Technologies Research Group.
That's right. And this series, well, it's designed to showcase some of the really exciting recent research that's happening right here within the group.
And today we're diving into something I think is truly fascinating. It's at this intersection of virtual reality, human communication, and, well, a specific community, finding some really unique ways to connect.
Yeah, it really is. We're exploring the insights from a paper called A User Study on Deaf Individuals in VR Social Spaces, the Emergence of the VR Sign Language.
Okay, and this work comes from Lara McIntyre and Marco Gilardi. They're both part of the UWS Creative Computing Technologies Research Group, School of CEPS.
Exactly. And our goal today really is to kind of unpack this paper for you, make it accessible, and also to highlight why it's so important and, frankly, novel in its findings. We want to understand the challenges deaf individuals are facing in VR spaces.
But also, there's this unexpected innovation that's emerging, right? Something popping up in these virtual worlds.
That's the really intriguing part, how a lack of ideal accessibility is almost paradoxically leading to something entirely new, a new form of language, basically.
Okay, let's get into that. The paper starts by setting the scene, talking about a fundamental issue, social isolation, something many deaf individuals experience.
Right. And often that stems from, well, the hearing majority just lacking awareness about deafness or not knowing any sign language, SL.
And it's not as simple as just turning on captions in VR, is it? The paper points that out.
No, not at all. That's a key point. Standard accessibility like captions isn't always a perfect fit, especially for profoundly deaf users whose first or preferred language is SL.
Why is that?
Well, there can be significant grammatical differences between, say, written English and various sign languages. So reading captions might feel, a bit foreign or just clunky if SL is your native way of communicating.
That makes sense. It underlines how complex sign language actually is. It's much more than just, hand shapes.
Oh, absolutely. The paper emphasizes this really well. SL is holistic. It involves crucial non-manual features.
Like facial expression.
Exactly. Facial expressions, body language, posture, even lip patterns. These all convey grammatical information and nuance. It's not just about what your hands are doing.
And there are regional differences too, right? Like BSL versus ASL.
Yeah, good point. British Sign Language, BSL, often uses two hands for fingerspelling, whereas American Sign Language, ASL, typically uses one. Just one example of the diversity.
So if a VR system only tracks your hands, or maybe just your head position,
you lose a massive part of the language.
Yeah.
You lose the grammar, the tone, the full expression.
And that's a big problem with current VR attempts to incorporate SL.
It is. Many current applications, if they try at all, tend to focus just on hand gestures. They often ignore or can't capture those vital non-manual features, which really limits how fully people can express themselves.
Okay, so despite these challenges, both in the real world and with the tech, the paper finds that deaf individuals are actively using social VR platforms.
They are. They're turning to platforms like VR Chat to connect with others globally using sign language, specifically trying to reduce those real-world barriers.
So how did the researchers figure this out? What was their approach?
They used a human-centered approach, focusing on a user need analysis. They conducted semi-structured interviews.
Okay. And who did they talk to?
They interviewed deaf VR users, some hearing SL users, and also an interpreter. They found these participants through an online community known as Helping Hands.
Let's talk about the results. What did they find regarding the VR platforms themselves? VR Chat came up.
It did, quite a bit. Under the VR platform theme, VR Chat was clearly popular, even though users acknowledged its limitations.
People were using it to connect with friends.
Yeah. One person said, I use VR for playing VR games and often for VR Chat, where I hang out with deaf friends regularly. It became a regular social space.
And the scale of it must be a factor, too.
Definitely. Another quote highlights this. I use VR Chat because it's popular. There's over 115,000 online, and that's why many deaf people are there. Just the sheer number of potential connections.
Well, popular doesn't mean perfect, especially for signing. You mentioned limitations.
Right. Users reported specific technical hurdles, things like server delays, lag, which really disrupts the flow of a signed conversation, and also the controllers themselves. Their physical design could actually prevent certain SL gestures.
How so?
Well, one user gave a great example about trying to make a claw shape or crossing fingers or touching one hand to another. They said, the controllers have a barrier and I can't bend my fingers fully. The physical object got in the way of the language.
Wow, the hardware itself interfering with linguistic expression. That's quite something. Okay, so platforms have issues, controllers can be clunky. What about the headsets? Did that make a difference? That was the VR technology theme.
Yes, exactly. Participants mainly use 3 headsets: the Valve Index, the Quest 2, and the much more high-end Varjo Aero. And each one had its own strengths and weaknesses for signing.
Okay, let's take the Valve Index first. What was the verdict there?
The Index was generally preferred because its controllers offer better finger tracking compared to many others, but crucially, it still wasn't perfect.
Still limited.
Yeah, one user said, "I'm using Valve Index due to the finger tracking on controllers. But some BSL signs need to be fingerspelled due to the limitations. So even with the best available consumer finger tracking at the time, some adaptation, like resorting to fingerspelling, was still necessary."
Okay, so adaptation is already a theme here. What about the Quest 2? That's probably the most common headset out there.
Right. The Quest 2 users described it as manageable, but signing was difficult because it's limited to, I think, just 7 predefined hand gestures.
Only 7? Wow.
Yeah. So you're stuck with a very small menu of hand shapes. The quote was, "I use a Quest 2. It's manageable since I'm on limited predefined hand gestures."
But they still made it work somehow.
They did. And this is important. Users find workarounds. They create sort of primitive versions of signs using the available gestures, and apparently these are often still legible to others used to the system. It hints at that adaptation we'll discuss more.
Definitely. And the third one, the Varjo Aero. That's not one you hear about as often.
No, it's very expensive, high-end enterprise gear mostly, but one participant used it. They said, "I'm using Varjo Aero now because it has eye tracking, but it's really expensive."
Eye tracking. How does that help?
Well, eye gaze is actually part of communication, including in SL, so having that tracked adds a new layer to communication, as the user put it. It adds back some of that non-manual information.
I see. But the takeaway seems to be that none of these current technologies fully support natural sign language yet.
That's the clear message from the users. The technology imposes constraints that directly impact the ability to sign naturally.
Which, as you said, raises that big question. If the tech isn't really built for it, how are people managing to communicate effectively using sign in VR?
And this is where the study introduces its most significant, its novel finding. The researchers identified the emergence of something they report on for the first time: virtual reality sign language, VRSL.
VRSL, wow. Like a distinct dialect adapted for VR.
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
a good way to put it. It's explicitly not the same as sign language used in real life.
Right.
Users estimated it might only be, say, 50% to 75% similar.
Okay.
It's an adaptive response born directly out of the limitations of the current VR technology and platforms they're using.
Can you give an example?
Sure. One participant said, "Signing in VR is not really the same as in real life, maybe 75% or 50% similar, but we try to adapt and find ways to communicate."
And someone actually called it VRSL.
Yes. Another participant stated, "We call it VRSL, VR Sign Language, because we still understand each other if you get used to it." The community itself named it.
So the technology fails to support the language fully, and the community's response is to essentially invent a modified version that can work within those technological boundaries.
Precisely that. It's this incredible example of human ingenuity and linguistic adaptation. But it wasn't necessarily easy for users.
How so?
Well, some users mentioned having to almost relearn sign language to understand and use VRSL effectively. One said, "At first, I had to sort of relearn the SL to understand the VRSL. Imagine needing to adjust your native language just to function in a specific digital space."
That's quite a cognitive load. And is this VRSL consistent, or does it vary depending on the platform or headset?
That's another layer the study uncovered. It seems VRSL is often platform dependent. Meaning the specific signs, the workarounds, the adaptations people develop can differ based on the technology they're using, like the Quest 2 example.
Right, with its 7 hand shapes. How would that work for something specific?
The paper gives the example of signing Monday in BSL. The proper BSL sign involves specific finger contact, which isn't one of the Quest 2's 7 predefined gestures.
So what's the VRSL workaround on Quest 2?
They have to fingerspell the whole word. Monday. But even that requires adaptation, because some standard BSL letter shapes aren't available either.
Seriously, like which ones?
For example, the BSL letter M usually involves touching the top 3 fingers to the thumb. On the Quest 2, that specific shape isn't an option, so in VRSL on that platform, they use the basic hand open gesture to represent M.
That's absolutely fascinating. It shows how technology isn't just a neutral conduit. It actively shapes the communication, forcing users to innovate linguistically when the design falls short.
It's a powerful testament to user creativity and resilience. But the study didn't just focus on signing itself. It also highlighted broader accessibility problems in VR.
Okay, like what else came up?
Well, things that you might think would be basic, like subtitles or captions. Users expressed real frustration that many VR games and apps simply don't offer them.
Despite being a common accessibility feature elsewhere.
Exactly. One person put it very clearly. Some VR games do not support subtitles, which I found frustrating, and I believe they should be a basic accessibility feature in all games.
And we already talked about how captions aren't always a perfect solution anyway due to language differences.
Right. The paper touches on that too. While many deaf individuals are fluent in written English, factors like early language deprivation can sometimes mean complex English grammar in captions is still a barrier if SL is primary. It just points to a need for designers to have better deaf awareness.
Were there other communication breakdowns mentioned?
Yeah, users talked about situations where signing just fails because the tech can't capture it properly. In those cases, they have to resort to, like, typing in clunky chat boxes or using virtual pens to write in the air.
Which sounds pretty slow and awkward.
Very. And they expressed a wish for better built-in communication alternatives for moments when signing isn't fully viable in the current tech.
There was also a really striking point about cost, wasn't there? A feeling of unfairness.
A very strong feeling, yes. Participants pointed out that hearing users typically get VR systems with built-in microphones for free, seamless voice communication.
Right.
But deaf users, if they want richer communication that includes more body language and captures non-manual features better, often need to buy expensive add-ons like full-body tracking sensors.
Because sign language uses the whole body, not just hands.
Exactly, and those trackers can cost hundreds, even thousands of dollars. The quote that really hit home was, "I feel it's very unfair that hearing people get their VR with a free mic. But deaf people like us need to buy so many things for full body language to communicate. It's a significant financial barrier to equitable participation."
It really highlights an inequality in access.
Yeah.
But despite all these challenges, the tech limitations, the costs, the accessibility gaps, the study also found some really positive social outcomes, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's crucial. These VR platforms, despite their flaws, are proving incredibly powerful for connecting the global deaf community.
Oh, so.
Users emphasized how VR allows people from different sign language backgrounds, American Sign Language, ASL, British BSL, Japanese JSL, German DGS, and others, to meet and socialize in a shared space in ways that are often difficult in the physical world.
That sounds like a huge benefit, reducing that sense of isolation. Did it affect confidence?
Dramatically, according to the participants, one person said it beautifully. "In VR, it allows me to be myself, to express myself more. It allows me to find people with similar interests."
That feeling of being yourself.
Yeah. In VR spaces where signing is common, deaf users can experience being in the majority, which can be incredibly affirming compared to often being in the minority in the hearing world.
That makes sense. Were there any downsides to the social aspect?
The paper did note a safety concern. Users mentioned that very public, open VR spaces can sometimes be risky places with potential for trolling or harassment. They generally felt safer and had better experiences within established communities or private friend groups.
Okay, so taking all this user feedback, the good and the bad, the researchers didn't just stop at documenting the situation. They started building something.
That's right. The paper briefly mentions a work in progress. A low-fidelity prototype of a VR social space designed specifically for deaf users, based directly on the insights from their interviews.
What did that look like?
It had a strong visual focus, naturally, and it included features like dedicated areas for learning sign language, a cinema room intended for deaf awareness films or signed content, and just generally interactive spaces designed for comfortable signed conversation.
And they got some initial feedback on this prototype.
They did. Early thoughts included suggestions that the learning content could be perhaps more advanced or tailored, and practical things like the virtual seating pods needed to be large enough to give people adequate signing space.
Little details matter.
They really do. But features like the cinema room were received positively. It showed the potential value of designing with and for the community from the start.
It definitely shows how this kind of user-centered research can feed directly into better, more inclusive design. So wrapping up the paper's main points?
I think the conclusions really reinforce what we've discussed. They confirm the significant technological limitations currently hindering natural SL and VR.
Yeah.
They highlighted the emergence of VRSL as this really important novel adaptation by the user community. They underscored the positive social impact VR can have, despite the barriers, and they made a strong case for the critical need to address the accessibility gaps like lack of subtitles, poor non-manual feature support, and also the high costs of supplementary hardware.
Did they mention any limitations of their own study?
Yes, they acknowledged that their participant pool was relatively small and drawn mainly from one specific online community and platform, Helping Hands, and likely VR chat predominantly. So future research should definitely aim to include a broader range of users, platforms, and SL backgrounds.
But the core message, the call to action, seems clear.
Very clear. Future VR research, development, hardware design, it all needs to focus explicitly on creating technology that supports all the components of sign language. Hands, face, body, eye gaze, the whole package. Only then can we move towards truly natural and inclusive interactions for SL users in virtual reality.
It's really powerful work from Lara McIntyre and Marco Ghilardi. It shines a light on the user experience, the ingenuity, and the path forward. Great to see this kind of research coming from the UWS Creative Computing Technologies Research Group.
Absolutely. It sets a benchmark and points the way.
So if you're listening to this, what's the big takeaway? I think this deep dive shows us a community that's not just passively using technology, but actively reshaping it, or at least reshaping their language within it. They're pioneering VRSL in these virtual spaces that, frankly, weren't built with their needs fully front and center.
Yeah, it really throws into sharp relief the gap between a lot of current VR tech, which often has these accessibility blind spots, and the complex, nuanced requirements of sign language users who need full bodily expression.
And it's just a fantastic reminder, isn't it? Technology isn't static. It shapes us, but we also shape it. Human creativity and the drive to connect will find ways, even pushing boundaries in unexpected directions like VRSL, when needs aren't being met by designers.
It makes you think, doesn't it? So here's a final thought for you to ponder. We've seen how the deaf community adapted and created VRSL. How might the specific needs, the communication styles, the sheer creativity of other diverse language communities or groups with different communication needs continue to push VR development? What unimagined innovations or adaptations might emerge as more diverse users shape these digital spaces?